Information about a cold case 24 years after a body was found in the Columbia River.
Now the Clark County Medical Examiner's Office has been able to use genealogy to learn the identity of the man.
On October 26, 1998, a scary find was made along the banks of the Columbia River. It was a rainy day. Near Lower River Road in Vancouver, a body was found floating in the water. This sent shock waves through the neighborhood. Hello and welcome to our channel. If you are new here, please subscribe and press the bell notification. Let's have a look at the third John Doe cold cases finally identified in 2023. Authorities were quick to get to the scene, trying to find out who the unfortunate person was who had died so soon. As they got closer to the body, they could smell rotting flesh, which was a sign that the man had been in the water for a long time. Since it wasn't clear who the man was, they carefully took his body out of the water and took it away so they could start the hard work of figuring out who he was and doing an autopsy. They had no idea that this was the start of a puzzle that would keep them thinking about it for years. As the medical examiner's office started to do an autopsy on the body of the unidentified guy, a shocking fact came to light. He had been shot in the head, which was shown by the autopsy. But after looking at all the evidence, investigators were left with more questions than solutions. Had the man killed himself? Had someone else pulled the trigger? The truth was still hard to figure out. That wasn't all, though. The man was thought to have been in the water for anywhere from 6 months to a year. This made it hard for the officials to figure out what happened before he died. Even though time had passed, the medical examiner's office was still able to figure out how old the man was when he died. They thought he was around 53 years old. These new details only added to the puzzle of the case. Who was this person, and how did he die so horribly? The detectives had a hard time trying to figure out what happened to the man, and why it was so sad. They knew they had to figure out who he was first, but that wasn't easy, for the man had been found with no way to tell who he was, so the police had no place to start. The police looked at the records of people who had gone missing in the area in hopes of finding a clue. But their search turned up nothing, so they have no idea who the bones belonged to. They were desperate for answers, so they told agencies all over the Northwest in the hopes that someone, somewhere, would be able to identify the victim. Even though they looked hard, they didn't find what they were looking for. Fingerprints were another thing that could have helped detectives figure out who the man was. But this didn't happen because the body had already started to break down. As the days turned into weeks, it seemed like the case was coming to a dead end. Investigators were getting frustrated because they weren't any closer to figuring out who the man was or why he died so young. He stayed an unknown John Doe, which was a scary reminder of how many questions were still open about the case. Even though they tried hard, the case became less and less known over time. Another one of the many mysteries in the world. Even though the agents had done everything they could, the truth was still just out of reach. When it comes to fixing cold cases, time can sometimes help and sometimes hurt. Even though it may seem like there is less hope every year, new technology and advances in forensic science can give a case that was once thought to be hopeless new life. In 2008, the people who were looking into the case chose to look at the evidence again. They went to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification with the latest investigative tools and methods, hoping that the improvements in DNA profiling would finally help them find the answers they had been looking for so long. From the samples of the man's DNA that were taken during the autopsy, the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification was able to make a DNA analysis of him. Investigators were hopeful when they saw the DNA profile, so they sent it right away to the National DNA Database and waited excitedly for a match. The detectives didn't give up. They knew that each new advance in forensic science made it more likely that the story of the man found in the river would be solved. Investigators were keen to find out what happened to the man with no name after the case had gone cold for years. Around 2021, they decided to try something new. They sent a sample of the DNA from the remains to Bode Technology, a well-known forensic DNA lab in Virginia. Scientists at Bode Technology were excited to take on the task because they knew how to get DNA out of hard samples. They knew that if they looked at the DNA sample, they could find out who this mystery John Doe was. A forensic genealogist used DNA from the body parts to do a careful study of the person's family tree. The investigative genealogist on the other hand, found a connection between the family and a family from California. The clue was good, and the researcher pointed to one person in particular, the son of Chelsea Johnson Jr. and Ruth Marie Henson. Strangely, this person called Michael Johnson hasn't been seen or heard from since 1998. The detectives knew they had hit the jackpot and were now one step closer to finding out who the mystery John Doe really was. So, as the leaves fell in October 2022, Nikki Costa, who was in charge of operations at the medical examiner's office, solved the mystery of the unnamed man. Nikki found Russell Johnson and Kathy Bergen, two of Chelsea and Ruth Johnson's other children, and they told her some shocking things. It seems that their brother Michael vanished without a trace more than 20 years ago and stopped talking to the family. Could this be the lost link that detectives have been looking for so long? Nikki was determined to find out who the man with no name was. She never gave up on the idea that Michael's DNA was in the sample. Nikki called several places to find out if what she thought was true. She was determined to find the missing piece of the story. The California Department of Justice's DNA program for missing people looked at samples from family members, and the Wasatch County Sheriff's Office got a DNA sample from Johnson's sister Kathy. In the meantime, the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification sent its 2008 DNA profile to California's Missing People program so that it could be compared with all the other evidence. Dr. Martha Burt, the top medical examiner for Clark County, finally came to the conclusion that the man who couldn't be found was Michael. The man finally had a name and a chance at justice thanks to Nikki's hard work and the work of many organizations working together. Investigators still don't know much about Michael's last days before his body was found, so they don't know much about the mysterious events surrounding his death. Now, the police are asking for help from the public, hoping that someone will come forward with information about what happened to Michael. Every bit of information could be important, and the police are eager to figure out what happened in this strange case. Independence Pass John Doe. On June 19, 1970, two young guys went for a stroll on Independence Pass in Twin Lakes, Colorado. It was a beautiful summer day. The day was great for a walk because the air was cool and the sun was shining. But when they found something horrible, their trip took a turn they didn't expect. As they walked down the road, they saw a man's rotting body in a ditch on the north side. Rocks that had fallen from the hill above covered some of it, but that wasn't the worst part. As the two guys got closer, they saw that the body was missing its left arm and rib cage. It was a horrible sight, and their hearts were beating fast out of fear and uncertainty. The body was wearing a torn hoodie and gray pants, and the smell of decay was too strong to ignore. Who was that person? What was wrong with him? As they stood there stunned by what they had just learned, these questions kept going through their thoughts. The two men didn't waste a single second before calling the police, who came to the scene quickly. As they got closer to the rotting body, they thought the guy was in his early 20s. The police looked at the scene carefully and wrote down everything that might help them figure out what happened. The officers also saw that the man was missing his left arm and rib cage. He was also wearing 3 sets of socks and hiking shoes. Even a sock pulled over his left shoe was found. But they also found other strange things. When they looked through the man's pockets, they found $7 and a razor. But those things didn't tell us much about who the man was or what happened to him. The man had no cash or ID with him, so the police had no idea who he was or what had happened to him. Officers also looked all over the area around the body for signs, but they didn't find any. The man's body was quickly taken away from the scene of the crime and taken to a lab for analysis. But no matter how hard police tried, they couldn't figure out who he was. They looked through reports of missing people, talked to people in the area, and even looked through tooth records, but nothing seemed to fit. The man was a complete mystery, and the more they looked into him, the more mysterious he became. The police were confused by how the body was found. The man looked like he had been out in the weather for a long time, maybe even all winter, but his clothes didn't seem right for such hard weather. The cops also couldn't help but wonder what happened to the body parts that were missing. Had they been taken out after death, or had wild animals eaten them? Even though it was a horrible thought, they couldn't rule it out. More than 3 weeks after the body was found, a state highway worker looked under the road where the body was found and found the missing limb. The shoulder and arm were bare, but the hand and wrist still had skin on them. The finding made the mystery even bigger. How did the limb get there, and why was it not with the rest of the body? The way the body part was found was strange, so the police officers thought it might have been taken away after the man died, maybe by a snowplow, but they didn't have any proof. As time went on, the strange man who was found at Independence Pass was just a memory. Because he didn't have any ID, he had no name, so he was called Independence Pass John Doe. He was buried with a simple marker that said unidentified male in Leadville's Evergreen Cemetery. The case went cold, and as time went on, it seemed like no one would ever find out who Independence Pass John Doe really was. In 2011, a man named John Pearson, who had spent years cleaning up the Evergreen Cemetery, found the grave of the Independence Pass John Doe while cleaning a wooded area. He thought if Independence Pass John Doe might also be a Vietnam War veteran. Pearson's curiosity led him to contact Audrey Simpkins, a crime and intelligence researcher with the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. Simpkins then asked Sylvia Pedham, an expert at finding John and Jane Does, for help. Together, they went to the small town in August 2011 to find out what was going on with the strange grave. But despite their attempts, the case went cold again, so for the time being, no one knows who John Doe is from Independence Pass. After being quiet for 2 years, the case of the Independence Pass John Doe began to move forward in 2013. Audrey and Sylvia went back to Leadville to look for the case records, but they had already been lost. Together with the coroner at the time, Shannon Kent, they made sure that the facts of the case were put into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons Systems database. Sylvia, who was determined, then asked the Lake County Sheriff to dig up John Doe's body so that DNA could be taken. The body was dug up, and a fingerprint was taken with the help of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. At the University of Northern Texas, DNA was taken from the chondro's femur and the skull. This gave people new hope that they could finally find out who the unknown guy was. But John Doe's body was not put to rest in his grave at Evergreen Cemetery. Instead, it was kept in a coffin in the office of the old Lake County coroner, Shannon. The man was finally reburied after 8 long years. In 2022, when things were quiet, a big step forward was made in the long-running case. A group of officers took John Doe's DNA and sent it to a lab for forensic genetic genealogy testing. The test gave us a good sign. There were still a lot of unknowns about this lead, but it was enough to break the case wide open. After all these years, John Doe was finally given a name: Gardner Paul Smith. He was only 39 years old when his body was found. Gardner was no longer just a faceless body in a grave. He had a name, a story, and a family. Gardner was born on September 22, 1930, in Modesto, California. He was the older son of Paul and Bernita Smith, and he grew up in a family that skied. Both of Gardner's parents skied, so it was only normal that he and his younger brother Armour did too. Gardner didn't just ski for fun. It was his way of life. He went to school at the University of Nevada in Reno, where he not only studied but also participated on the ski team. Gardner was very committed to his sport, and he was always trying to get better. In fact, he was known to try out new techniques. Once, to improve his balance, he even did a big slalom course on cross-country skis. But Gardner wasn't just a good player. He was also a deep thinker and a humanist who was always trying to figure out what it meant to really be alive. In the last part of his life, he became interested in mental experiences and the powers of the mind, and he wanted to figure out how the mind works. He spent a lot of time looking into this field of study. When Gardner joined the Army in June 1951, he was a young man. He spent 2 years on active duty and then moved to the reserves, where he stayed for 4 more years. He did his job well, and in June 1957, he was let go. Gardner's path took him to Argentina, where he met Jennifer Dawn Andrews, the love of his life, in 1961. They got married, and Gardner brought his new wife back to California. Not long after that, on June 18, 1962, they had their first child, a girl named Jean. But Gardner left his wife and young daughter at some point. Jennifer got a divorce from Gardner in 1968, after which she married Ernest M. Dillard. Ernest died in 1974, which was sad, and Jennifer was once again a widow. Gardner, on the other hand, moved back and forth between California and Aspen after his divorce. Dick Dorworth, a good ski racer and close friend of Gardner's, remembers the last time he saw him in 1968 like it was yesterday. Gardner was living on the road and trying to get the word out about a new ski pole grip he had made. This wasn't the first thing he came up with. He had also made double-lens goggles, but he couldn't sell them. After sleeping on his friend's couch for a week, Gardner disappeared and Dorworth never saw him again. Jean, Gardner's daughter, had a lot of questions about her father, who had left when she was a baby. She didn't know where he went or why he never came back for her for years. Her mother and other family members didn't say much about his absence, so she had to figure out what happened to her father on her own. And she didn't find out who her father really was until many years later when his real name was found. Now that she is 60 and has her own family, Jean is determined to give her father the respect he deserves. She wants to plan a small military funeral for him and have a headstone made to honor him. Jean hasn't decided where he will be put to rest yet, but she will always have a special place in her heart for the father she never met. Gardner Smith's death continues to be a puzzle. Even though there is no record of an autopsy being done on him, the Colorado Bureau of Investigation says there was no proof of wrongdoing, and rumors continue to circulate about how he died. Some people think he may have been the victim of a crime, and that his body was dumped in Independence Pass. Others think he may have walked up there with the intention of hiking back down but got caught in a sudden storm, got lost, and died from the cold. But the truth about Gardner Smith's death stayed a secret, leaving a lot of questions unanswered. Romero, Edith Thomas E.T. On November 28, 1992, it was cold, and a group of people near the Walker Wildlife Area off River Road in Colorado saw something strange. As they got closer to the spot, they were horrified to see that a dead man's body was there without his head. But even after he died, the man said something. He wore green shorts with big black designs and a tan to black pullover shirt with a mystery logo on the left side of the chest. At the arms, the sleeves were cut off. People told the police about it, and they rushed to the spot with their sirens going. As soon as they got there, they started looking around for anything that could help them figure out who the man was. They looked everywhere and turned over every stone. But nothing happened. Even the man's clothes didn't tell the police anything about who he was, leaving them scratching their heads. They didn't have any other choice, so they took the body away for an autopsy and to try to figure out who it was. There, the medical inspector did an autopsy on the body, and what they found was shocking. The man had been cut to death, so there was no question that it was a murder. The news sent shockwaves through the town, and people started to feel afraid. Who and why would do something like that? The detectives knew they had a lot of work to do, but they were determined to figure out what happened. They had no idea that the road ahead of them would be full of turns and curves that would lead them down a dark path full of mystery and drama. Detectives started the investigation with a sense of purpose, looking for any clue that could help them get closer to solving the puzzle. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, it became clear that this wasn't going to be a normal case. The trail was cold, and every clue they followed led nowhere. They couldn't figure out why the man's head wasn't there, and it kept them up at night. Where might it have ended up? Was it taken as a trophy or hidden somewhere that no one could see? The detectives were desperate to find out what was going on, but they had a big problem: time. The case got colder and colder as the months turned into years. People started to forget about the man in green shorts, and it seemed like justice would never be done. But agents never gave up hope, and they knew they would find the truth one day. As the years went by, new technologies came out that were supposed to make their work easier. The case was looked into again in 2011, and the National Missing and Unidentified Persons Systems was brought in to help. But no matter how hard they tried, the agents ended up hitting a dead end again. Every clue they looked into seemed to lead nowhere, leaving them with nothing but more questions. Everyone was frustrated because they knew they might never find out who the man really was. But the cops didn't give up, even as more and more time passed. They knew that new information could always come to light, so they were always on the lookout and never let the case fully leave their minds. In 2022, the Mesa County Sheriff's Office was determined to find justice for the man in green shorts. They were going to try everything they could. They knew that traditional ways of investigating hadn't worked in the past, so they chose to use new technology. They contacted Othram, a business that does forensic DNA analysis, hoping that advanced genetic testing could help them finally figure out who the man was or find a close relative who could give them important information. Detectives were ready to try anything to solve the case, even though it was a long shot. But advanced DNA testing isn't cheap, and the cops knew they would need money to move forward. So, they went to DNA Solves, a website that uses crowdfunding, data from people who want to help, and cutting-edge genomics to solve cases that no one else could solve. Thanks to how hard the agents worked, and how kind people were, the money was raised and the testing could begin. The bones of the man in green shorts were a mystery that had stumped police for almost 30 years. But the amazing progress in forensic science finally let them start putting some of the pieces together. The parts were carefully packed and sent to Othram's high-tech lab in the Woodlands, Texas. There, a group of smart forensic experts worked hard to get DNA from the bones and put together a full genetic profile of the unknown man. Just having a DNA profile wasn't enough. The Othram team knew they needed to use this information to find clues that could help them figure out who the man was, so that's what they did. With the help of their in-house genealogy team and forensic genetic genealogy, they were able to find the man's distant cousins and make a full family tree. The Mesa County Sheriff's Office was then given this information, and they were able to find a possible brother of the unknown man. The team at Othram was able to prove that the unnamed man was Edith Thomas Romero by getting a DNA sample from this sibling. The Mesa County Sheriff's Office made a big step forward when they found out who Edith was, but his death was still a secret, so detectives knew they had to dig deeper to find the truth. Edith had come a long way since he was young, but many things about his childhood are still a secret. Even so, agents were able to figure out what kind of person he had become. As detectives looked into his background, they found that he was a man who had served others and made sacrifices his whole life. His time in the military was just one example of how brave he was. They found out that Edith had only been alive for 26 years when he died. In 1991, he had gone to Grand Junction, Colorado, with 2 other people from Louisiana. He lived in a house on 4th Street that has since been torn down. He worked as a cook in a nearby restaurant. Not much was known about how he died, but it is thought that he was killed in the summer of 1992. Now, as police try to figure out what happened to Edith, they need the public's help. If you know anything about his sudden death that could help explain it, please don't wait to tell the police. We could get closer to the truth with every bit of information. How did you feel about this case? What do you think of the police's first look into the case? We'd love to hear what you think in the comments.